And the author Matthew Syed, he coined this phrase black box thinking, which comes from aviation. I also showed this slide in the first lecture of the year. And that idea of transparently recording a process and then scrutinizing it for errors in a way that's not looking to apportion blame, but simply understand what went wrong and see if any significant changes can be made to ensure that it doesn't go wrong again in the future. It's called black box thinking, named after the black box recorder that sits in any aircraft, and it's designed to survive a fatal air crash and therefore bring back voice recordings and flight data that helps investigators understand what went wrong. With that in mind, let's look to a couple of examples of forms of learning that we understand and how their different characteristics influence how they play out in an organizational context. So first, if we've got single loop learning. Now this may not be the first time you've come across single loop learning, but I want to return to it in the context of team performance dynamics and thinking about mindset, that concept that was introduced from Carol Dweck earlier. So single loop learning can be described like a thermostat for a heating system in a house, where it detects the temperature variations and then takes action to correct deviations from the predetermined norm, i.e., this is a system that has a fixed idea of what the status quo or what the environment should be like, and it's programmed to change in order to correct things towards that predetermined status quo or the way things should be. So single loop learning is based on a lot of assumptions, we can say. In the case of a thermostat, which is just a piece of electronic engineering, there is an assumption built into the setting up of that thermostat as to what the correct temperature is. So what is the right temperature? So that translates for us in single loop learning to say that built into our attitudes are assumptions around about what the correct way to go about things is, and therefore we make adjustments within when we make mistakes or when we encounter challenge, we make adjustments back towards what we assume correct to be. So learning occurs to bring a behavior skill aspect of knowledge into line with the supposed correct best practice. So that looks at sort of performance optimization. So we can focus on the sort of questions like, how can we better achieve that standard of performance? And single loop learning has a role to play. It's valuable in the refinement of skills. It makes an approach repeatable and reliable. And it also requires limited mental effort on an individual basis and limited resource output from a team or organizational perspective. So single loop learning has a role to play, and it's, as we'll come on to find out, it's essential that we have some single loop learning in the way we go about our day-to-day business, because otherwise it would be very exhausting for us. A more sophisticated and taxing form of learning is double loop learning. Now in double loop learning, errors are detected and corrected in ways that entail significant modification of underlying norms and policies. So the distinguishing feature between double loop learning and single loop learning is that in single loop learning we have quite a strong set of assumptions that inform the context within which we acquire knowledge or correct mistakes. In double loop learning, what we're doing is actually addressing those assumptions. So we are questioning the basis upon which we normally go through the process and then seeing if something new can emerge from it. So with double loop learning, we are potentially breaking or changing established routines, and we are therefore challenging the norms. And those norms are the things that correction is made towards in single loop learning. So the correction is only a correction when it's understood in relation to the assumptions that are made towards our normal learning. In double loop learning, the correction is rendered redundant almost because we are challenging the basis on which we understand that correction to be required. So the sort of question we ask in double loop learning is that an appropriate target in the first place? Is the way in which we are going about this the most effective, safe, profitable, cohesive, inclusive way of going about it? So that is learning from first principles, and therefore it's mentally demanding. I made a stress of emphasizing that single loop learning is necessary because it is proportionately far less taxing. Double loop learning is a highly taxing process. And to demonstrate what this looks like, these two concepts look like together within the context of going through a process of actions in, say, an organizational team, Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen presented it like this. You've got governing values that inform your actions, and your actions sometimes, well, they always lead to consequences, and sometimes that includes mismatches or errors, so things go wrong. When those consequences occur, single loop learning returns you to question the actions you took. But double loop learning brings you to question the governing values that informed those actions in the first place. So perhaps the actions, any of the actions you could have taken were not appropriate, and you need to readdress the governing values that inform them. Now I know that many of you, for your assignments, will have looked at the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. You may also have looked at the work of Herb Simon. And these are both sets of authors are Nobel Prize winning authors around about the same subject area. First of all, Herb Simon, and then Kahneman and Tversky. And most of that body of work culminated in the understanding of defensive routines and the brain processes that inform single loop and double loop learning. And defensive routines are what occur when you transition from double loop to single loop learning. That's assuming that double loop learning is happening in the first place to establish governing values, for example, or the principles through which you take action or make decisions. So assuming that takes place first, you then transition to single loop learning, whereby you are content with the set of actions you've determined to be appropriate for the context in which you're operating. And you now start to automize the response you have to certain situations. And that automation means that the brain is starting to move the location of the call to action from the front of your brain from the conscious mind into the unconscious mind, because it's learning these routines, and they become known as defensive routines because our brain is like a computer processor, and our brain is constantly trying to find ways of making its operation more efficient so that it can keep capacity for any unknown challenges that it may encounter that will suddenly load it with activity. So the brain is always looking to establish automized sets of processes which allow it to kind of store the processes to the hard drive at the back of our brains. And the result of that is single loop learning and then defensive routines, whereby actually our brain fights against us to break free of the routines it's established, because it likes the fact that it can carry out these processes without using the very taxing conscious mind. So defensive routines are essentially single loop routines which are no longer appropriate. Individuals and organizations are replete with them, but they're difficult to spot and extremely resilient. Now, why does it say that on this slide? It says that because when we come to recognize the fact that defensive routines are established by the brain and the fact that we know the brain is fighting against us to change them, defensive routines are essentially the negative cousin of single loop routines, because defensive routines are understood to be resistant to change and therefore resistant to potential improvement, because the brain doesn't care about improving, it cares about carrying out the processes that have been programmed into it in the most efficient way possible. And we've all got defensive routines, and they can be as mundane as the way that we make a cup of tea, what we say when we answer the phone, to the way that we respond to threats. If you have a defensive routine established that you respond to a threat through physical violence, then it takes a lot of effort and probably intervention and treatment from others to get you to unlearn that defensive routine and stop responding to a threat with violence. Defensive routines can be detrimental to our progress through life, and they can also lead to easy mistakes. Now, I mentioned unlearning in the last slide, and the unlearning is what follows on from trying to break out of defensive routines. And because our brain is always on the lookout for things it can store as a single loop process, and therefore a defensive routine, whenever we come to learn something new, more often than not, the first thing we have to do before we establish our new pattern of behavior or learning is to unlearn what we already know. And under pressure in particular, we tend to revert to habitualized behavior. And that has a compounding effect when we're operating in any kind of mission critical environment, whether that be in business or in sport or flying a plane. If we are challenged and we're under threat, for example, or under high pressure or under high cognitive load, which is very often something we find in the business world or in situations where disaster is ensuing, when we're at high cognitive load, i.e. we've got lots of things going on in our brain, lots of sensory information coming in, different instruments giving us different readings or different people making demands on our time, we tend to start to revert to defensive routines because our brains simply don't have the capacity to keep everything going at once whilst it's being asked to take action. So the biggest problem that we face when we're trying to learn something new is to unlearn what we already know.